So compared to this jig, the next one I'm making is going to take a fraction of the time. It'll do similar things to this one, but I think it'll be more versatile for routing things that aren't just straight mortises. And it's also going to be more portable, so I could take it with me to a customer's house or on a job. So I've seen a lot of variations of this sort of jig. In general, the principle is going to be similar across the board. So what this is, it's covered in paper now, but this is a 5/16 piece of plexiglass. I got this from McMaster-Carr. They don't carry plexiglass this thick in the hardware stores by me. And I got a 12-inch square one, 5/16. It was $20. You could probably get away with a 1/4 inch. I saw that at the Lowe's the other day, but it is a little thin, so I decided to go with something thicker, considering you're going to be rounding out some slots, and this is going to be your fence on top of wood. You wanted it to be as stable as possible. Basic principle for this one, and it's similar to the first one I made in that you're making it to fit your specific router, is you're going to drill out a 2-inch center hole on center, which you saw me drawing these X's to get my center mark, and then you're going to be making 2 1/4-inch slots about 2.5 inches in from the edge. Like I said, you want to give yourself plenty of room. I came in, I think, 1 3/4 inches on the side, gave myself plenty of room so that this doesn't get flimsy towards the corners. With that 1.25 inches coming in, this groove is over 8 inches, which means I could use this router fence on lumber up to about 8 inches wide, 8 inches thick, which is probably the extent of what I would ever use it for anyway. I'm going to be cutting these slots out the exact same way I did on the piece I did before with a straight bit on my router fence. I'm going to be cutting this out with a hole saw and plexiglass. You can cut it with these tools similar to woodworking. You want to move very slow. As the bit heats up, it will actually melt the plexi. So you might, for something this thick, you might even have to take some breaks as well and probably lower the speed on your tools. So then once you have these slots, what you're going to do is we're going to make 3/4 inch slabs and with holes in them, and those slabs will run perpendicular to the parallel slots, and those can be adjusted to sandwich in between your fence, and you could cut mortises. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut out this circle, and then I'm going to cut out these slots, and then the jig is essentially almost done. So the next consideration is going to be your router base. So I'm going to be using the same router, and what I did was I took all these screws out so that I could mark my holes. Now these holes right here go into the base. These bigger holes, there's 3 of them, 1, 2, 3, are what I'm going to use to mount the plexi to the bottom of my router. I used my compass to draw that 2-inch circle, and then I measured this, and this is 1.25 inches, so I set my compass to 5/8 of an inch, and I drew another circle on the inside so I could plop this right on there and line this up to drill my holes. Had that lined up, I could then put the plastic piece on there, and I marked right here and then drew a straight line with my straight edge so I could line that edge up perfectly on that line. And these are going to be the 3 holes I'm doing, so I can mark those. Now it's important when doing this to remember where the arms to the wooden fences on the underside of this are going to be. They're going to run this way, which means you're always going to be running down a piece this way. Which means with my router propped in place, those 2 pieces of wood are going to be running this way and that way. You want to make sure that your router's mounted parallel to those. If you could tell by the little arrow that's always showing you which way to go. If you were to accidentally mount it this way, that means you'll always be cutting on the wrong side of the spinning bit if you're pushing it forward and back going that way. So I just wanted to make sure that this is mounted the right way. Then those holes, 3 holes, will be drilled and countersunk from the bottom. And unfortunately, these screws, I had some spare hardware laying around to test all these pieces, These screws fit this one right here, and this is a 15/64 bolt. I just don't have these in my shop. There's a couple places I could look, but I don't think I have any, so I won't be able to test this out today. I'm going to have to order 3 of these, and you're going to want the ones with the flanges so that they countersink into your piece. So it's an unfortunate size bolt to have. To cut these slots, I'm going to do it the exact same way I did for the other jig with that down spiral cutting bit. I'm going to go in smaller passes just because the plexi has more of a tendency to crack if you try and take out too much at a time. I set my fence up so that the bit goes right through that center line on both sides, and then I put my tape marks as well as arrows so I know which side should always be facing the fence. So this way, with those marks, I know I line up this edge, can drop it on the bit, slide it over, and when it hits this tape mark, lift it up. There is those slots cut. And for my guides, I just use 3/4 inch plywood. Ideally, you would probably use a hardwood, but I don't really have anything in the shop to use, but I had this. I cut it to 1.25 inches, and then you could see in the video I lined it up with the holes in order to get my marks, and then I drilled 1/4 inch holes in there. And I had these 3-inch carriage bolts on hand. They might be a little bit too long, but that's what I'm going to use so I don't have to change them out, with washers and wing nuts, and I could put this whole thing together. So then the last thing to do is going to be to drill those 3 holes, but like I said, I don't have the hardware. I'm going to have to go get it. I finished the bulk of this build yesterday, minus mounting the router to it, and then these are put in there with carriage bolts so that once they're in the hole, the bolts can't spin when you're trying to tighten these wing nuts, and there's a washer on top as well. These bolts are actually, I think, 3-inch bolts. You could probably get away with 2.5. I might actually buy smaller ones just so these aren't sticking up as much. But then you could just loosen these and tighten them and slide those back and forth and really route a variety of options. The other nice thing about this jig is you could completely take off one side and use this as a straight edge for cutting rabbits and dados, which would be pretty nice. I think what I'm going to do now is, I have that 15/64 inch bolt that fits in there, and I just really don't feel like going to the store. So I have what I need, these flat-headed bolts, these flat-headed screws in 1/4 inch. So I think what I'm going to do, which is something I might regret, is I'm going to re-tap these holes for 1/4 inch hardware and hopefully get this jig finished and not compromise the holes I already have. So I'm going to get my tap set out and start doing that. I'm going to get into super detail about how I tap these out. If you don't even know how to tap things, you probably shouldn't approach this method at all. I'm not really recommending it. I would prefer to stay with the stock holes, but this will save me a lot of time. So I'm probably just going to film the process. It shouldn't be too bad since the holes are already drilled and everything. I'm just going to lightly knock down the threads with a bigger size drill bit and then use the tap. So that was working exactly how I was hoping it was going to work. It was super easy to do because, like I said, the hole's already close to the size that you want. So I wasn't worried about drilling this at a weird angle because that bit fits in there pretty nicely. And this is in there snug. There's no play or anything in it. And that means that I can do the other two and then drill the holes in my plexi, countersink them so the screws flush, and then this jig will be done. So I drilled out those holes to mount my base to it, and since these are now 1/4-inch holes, I just used the same drill bit I originally used. And now that these are drilled out, I could take the paper off of the plexi and see if it fits on my router and reassemble the whole thing. And this jig I don't necessarily think I need for my upcoming project. I'm going to mostly be using this one, so I'll probably test this one out on some scrap just to put it in the video, initial impressions of it. But as soon as this I see if it fits and maybe do a test pass on something, then I'm going to start using this one to make all my legs. Now you can make this exact same jig without using plexi, using some sort of hardboard or even plywood. I chose plexi because when you're doing routing applications, it's especially fine-tuned ones, it's so much easier if you could see through over here. Over here is not as important, but I like being able to see what I'm doing, and if this is a solid piece, it just makes life a little bit harder. There's a little more guesswork involved. You can really gauge what you're cutting and where you're going with using plexi. For this jig, there's 4 things I'm about to try out on this scrap piece of 2x6 I have. And if it can perform these 4 tasks, I'll be super happy with it. It's going to save me a lot of time. The first one's going to be just a regular mortise. I want to see how well it cuts regular mortises. Sometimes this won't work for that, especially on thicker pieces, so I want to see if I could cut a topside mortise in a piece that's at least 5.5 inches. The other thing I want to do is, if you watch my last build, which was a bed build, I had to cut rectangular pockets in a side rail for a bed in order to receive a bolt. So I want to see if I could set up this jig to cut not just straight lines, but irregular size pieces in lumber. I also want to test out taking off one side of the jig and cutting tenons on the edge of longer pieces of wood. I have a really nice tenoning jig for my table saw, which works great, but my ceiling's really low, and if I have to cut tenons on long pieces of wood, I usually do it on my radial arm saw, but it would be nice to be able to do it on my router because it will be a more accurate, cleaner cut. And then the last thing I want to try out is doing keeping one of the legs off again and cutting straight lines down a piece. That way I could cut long dados, I could cut long rabbets, long straight edges, and see how that works. So my initial reaction to the plexiglass jig is it's awesome. It did all 4 jobs I wanted it to do. It did all 4 jobs I was hoping it was going to be able to do with minimal setup. It cut that mortise really fast. From someone who has used drill presses and straight edges to cut mortises, I could say that that's probably the fastest mortise I've ever cut. This one took a little bit of time to figure out how to get the jig to work the way I wanted it to, but now that I know how to set it up, irregular shapes is going to be easy as well. You could see in the video what I did was I set a fence on either side so it stopped at these edges, but then to get it to go this way, all you had to do was drag the router all the way to one edge and set this fence against here, then drag the router all the way to this edge and set that fence against there, and then it gives you the room to maneuver it back and forth. The tenon was pretty self-explanatory, that worked really easily, and the long edge, you could see I actually cut through the bottom of this one, super straight, works really well. The one drawback which you might have seen in the video, kind of mad at myself because I should have picked up on this way earlier, is these wing nuts can't go all the way past because it hits the carriage. Now, you wouldn't have this fence all the way up here anyways, so it's only going to be a problem if I want to cut edge pieces. It's easily remedied by making another one of these out of thicker stock, which will move the wing nut further back, so I can make a specialized fence if I want to cut rabbits and dados on the edges of pieces I can mount into here. So like I said, it's an easy remedy. But if you're making this DeWalt has a huge base. I wouldn't really want to move these further to the edge anyway. This plexi is pretty strong, but there's definitely some give in it. So that is something to think about where your wing nuts are going to hit your piece. Decided I didn't want to worry about messing up those rabbits on the edge of my cabinet, so all I did with this was I just made a much longer fence guide. This is over twice as long as the other one. It's long enough that it should never go past the span of the legs. I'm going to try that out to cut this router. I'm going to try that out to cut these rabbits that have the legs on them. Long fence routing on the legs for the top worked really well. The problem with the bottom is the legs are a little bit longer, so my bit lines up a little bit past my original groove. So I'm basically just going to cut this bottom a little bit wider and then clean up this front edge with a piece. And that's just because the slots don't go deep enough to push this further. So mine is completely modifying my jig, which I'm not going to do. This is kind of the easiest way to deal with this. I cut that groove and I took all of my fences off of that router jig, and with that nice big surface area of my faceplate, I'm just going to go back in and freehand that extra piece off.